I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of NHMRC, show some data from recent rounds, and make a few other comments that I hope are additional to what you will hear in this workshop. But when I look at the program, I think it looks just fantastic. And I really wish I'd had access to this kind of guidance myself in my days as a researcher. Has that moved to the next slide for you? Yes, I hope so.
Yes, it has. And that's perfect.
Thank you. In that case, it's definitely under control. So a few words about NHMRC, and I know this will be familiar to many people, but it's always a good place to start. NHMRC is the Australian Government's lead funding agency for health and medical research. Of course, now we have the MRFF as well, and I'm delighted that you're going to be hearing from Ian Fraser. NHMRC is very closely connected to the MRFF, and we're delivering, excuse me, many schemes on behalf of the Department of Health for the MRFF. And so the relationship, of course, between the two groups and types of funding is extremely important. Now, I think it's always worth remembering that the mission of NHMRC is to build a healthy Australia. And of course, these aren't just words. They are really a reminder that everything we do at NHMRC is intended to support research that's going to lead to ultimate improvements in human health. But when I say that, I want to be clear that that takes a very broad and a long-term view. And so, as you'll know, NHMRC is very keen to support basic research that teaches us about the fundamentals of human health and the basis of human disease, as well as research that's much closer to the patient or the community through clinical research or through population health research or through health services research. So we do take that long view, and when we emphasize our connection to health, I want to be clear that we mean that full spectrum from biomedical research all the way through to delivery of better healthcare in the community and in the clinic. So at the moment, our budget for research is roughly $850 million each year. It comes from the federal budget each year, so of course we always watch that with great interest. That tells us the estimates of the funding that will be available for the 4 years ahead, but it is an annually delivered budget that creeps up year by year with CPI. And as I've said, the goal of all that funding is the improvement of human health. And last year we had about 5,800 applications in total across all of our schemes. We figured that that amounted to about $7.8 billion of requests for funding for our $850 million budget. So it's a very high pressure system, as I know everybody who's joined this workshop is aware. And we have at any one time quite a number of thousands of active grants that are being managed by institutions all around the country and of course by our office here. There are various schemes, and we'll talk about some of them today. They're almost all investigator initiated as opposed to being priority driven or top down. In other words, you come to us with your ideas and we don't tell you what ideas to have, and then you're in an open competition with all other applicants for the quality of your ideas and the proposal to support them. And then all of our funding is delivered based on peer review. It's useful to remember that NHMRC does more than fund research, and so we're very interested in the broad range of structures around research, and we have legislative responsibility for codes of ethics and for the regulation of research using human embryos. And in addition to that, we produce a lot of health guidelines and statements, sometimes on quite controversial subjects like health effects of wind farms or health effects of e-cigarettes and other kind of topical issues. So we have quite a broad remit, but the single most important one of those, I think, is the delivery of the roughly $850 million every year. Now, you'll be very aware of the schemes that we offer, but I do want to say a few words about them. And for those who've been around for a little while, you know that this is quite a radically different grant program from earlier times. The new grant program commenced in 2019, and so we've so far only had one cycle of all of the new schemes. We've had 2 cycles of investigator grants, but only one cycle of the whole of the grant program since its introduction at the beginning of last year. Now, the 4 new schemes that were introduced as part of the new grant program were investigator grants, synergy grants, ideas grants, and clinical trials and cohort studies grants, which we include in the list of strategic and leveraging grants that are on the right-hand side of this slide. And you're probably aware that each of these grants is really designed to do a different type of thing. The investigator grants are focused on the individual, and so they're largely track record driven, but the intention is that they provide a salary to that person if they need it. In other words, if they don't already have a substantive position such as a lectureship at a university, as well as a research support package, so that then they can have a 5-year grant which hopefully gives them enough money to be able to undertake a program of research which can be, depending on the size of the budget, of course, quite wide-ranging and highly flexible for the investigator to manage that research. So, of course, that means there's only one of those allowed to each investigator, and we're wrapping up quite a lot of their funding into one package. And then leaving other schemes, particularly the ideas grant schemes, to other researchers. The synergy grant scheme is focused on pulling together multidisciplinary, diverse teams to tackle a bigger problem than can be handled by a single investigator. $5 million, one-line, one-size-fits-all type of grant. And very interesting results in the first round of those in 2019 with a very diverse group of very exciting programs of research funded. The Ideas Grant scheme is the second largest of our schemes now after investigator grants. And this is, as you'll probably be aware, not track record driven. So whereas investigator grants and synergy grants are largely awarded based on the track record of the investigators, Ideas Grants largely awarded on the basis of the interest and innovation and quality of the idea and the science. And track record is not directly considered. It's only considered from the point of view of whether the person who's CIA and the team around them have the capability to deliver the project that's described. So it's not about how many Nature papers one has, it's about demonstrating the capability to deliver a project. Then the strategic and leveraging grants include a wide range of other schemes, many of which have been around for a long time and may well already be familiar to you. So collectively, these schemes in this whole grant program have a number of important features. They cover the full breadth of health and medical research, and so as I've said, we're very keen to support biomedical research as well as clinical research and population health research, research in health services. So they're intended to, these grants are intended to cover research that can be done in a lab or in a clinic or in the community, depending on its nature and its goals. We've designed a program here which supports research at different scales, from support for the individual through to teams, whether that be in centres of research excellence or in ideas grants or in synergy grants, as well as national networks. And we have a number of these now where we are funding research teams that are spread across the entire country and designed to bring people together across the entire country. We want this grant program to offer researchers flexibility for strategic thinking and collaboration. And the best example of that, I think, is investigator grants, because these are the ultimate flexible grant for the individual investigator to build a team and to build collaborative networks and to use their funds the best way they can to achieve their goals. So that might mean spending part of their funding on a postdoc in somebody else's lab, if that's the best way to get to the outcome of the research. We want to foster creativity and innovation, and the Ideas Grants, we hope, do that in a way that's a bit different from all of the other schemes, particularly because there's no track record assessment, and the focus really is on interesting ideas. We want to foster diversity in all its dimensions. Of course, that includes gender, but it also includes cultural diversity, and we think here particularly about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander researchers, but also diversity in discipline. We streamlined the fellowships schemes into the investigator grant schemes, so I won't talk about that more now, because fellowships are really now largely gone and a thing of the past. We don't need to talk about them. We have more 5-year grants than we used to because we want to give people the flexibility and the chance to take on larger problems. We have a dedicated clinical trials and cohort studies grant scheme. We're progressively and increasingly streamlining peer review processes and improving assessment criteria based on feedback through each round. And of course, as you know, there's a very important new focus on past research impact as part of track record for investigator grants and synergy grants. And I know you'll be talking about that a lot more in this workshop. Now, just to give you an idea of the spread of funds across these schemes, what's really obvious from this is that our very large schemes are investigator grants and ideas grants. And so it's no wonder that this is where most people focus their attention. There's quite a lot of money in those other schemes as well, but they're spread across multiple schemes. So the really big ones are now investigator grants and ideas grants. In the past, it was project grants, which were 50% of the budget and had the most attention. Now, I want to show you some data, excuse me, sorry, before that, I'll go on and say a little bit about how the funding is allocated before showing you some data from the last round and investigator grant round this year. So first of all, it's very important that the broad decisions about how funding is going to be allocated are made in advance so that we're not messing around as we go through the year thinking, oh, we'll put a bit more money here or take a bit more money from there. The decisions are made in advance on the advice of Research Committee and Council on how our $850 million will be allocated across those 4 groups of schemes that I showed in the earlier slide. So that's determined in advance. We're not going to come along later and say that we will shift money between schemes. So that's an important part of our management and the probity of the management of these schemes. You'll be aware that all applications are reviewed by several independent assessors, and the number of assessors varies with the scheme. And then some schemes use grant review panels, GRPs, to consider the shortlisted applications. The scores that emerge from that are those independent assessments, or GRPs, if GRPs are held, are then used to generate a ranked list of applications. And then we simply apply the budget from the top of that ranked list down to where the money runs out. Now, an important point here is that quite frequently we'll find, particularly in larger schemes, that we have 2 or 3 applications which have exactly the same score, in which case we will always fund both or all of those identically scored applications. Every now and then, that means we have to go fractionally over the budget or fractionally under the budget, but we will always make sure that if scores are equally ranked, then they will either be funded or they will not be funded. We won't be picking between them. Now, one of the reasons to show this slide is to explain something that we introduced a couple of years ago and is now a very important part of addressing some of the issues that we're concerned about. And that is that, again, in advance, we decide with the advice of Research Committee that part of the budget will be used for structural priority funding for a scheme. And this is used to fund additional near-miss applications in defined priority areas. So what we're doing is saying, for example, we might have 90% of the budget for investigator grants will be allocated simply down the ranked list from top until the funds run out. And then 10% of the budget will be used to fund additional grants below that funding cutoff, which meet structural priority areas. Now, again, in advance, these structural priority areas are identified with the advice of Research Committee. And currently, and for the last couple of years, they've been shown here: Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health research, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health researchers as CIAs, female CIAs, and I'll show you some data which explain why that is an issue, and health services research, which remains a relatively underfunded part of the spectrum of research that NHMRC seeks to fund. It's really important to know that these grants that are funded through the structural priority budget are still ones which have scored really well and are considered fundable. So anybody who is funded as a result of structural priority funding, it has submitted a very high quality, highly competitive project. But it, of course, the fact that we're doing this reflects the extreme competition at the moment and our concern about ensuring that we give opportunities to these groups which are really not receiving the fully equitable research funding that we believe it's important to foster. So I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute when I show you some of the data. Excuse me. So this is a summary of the funded rates for the major schemes, not all of our schemes in 2019. And then I've added in some data for 2020 where we have them, because of course the investigator grants round for 2020 has been completed and awarded. And you'll see in red for ideas grants the number of applications we've received for 2020 ideas grants. Now, these data are probably familiar to you, but I just think it's important to make a few points about them. First is the top 4 lines are the new grant schemes which were introduced last year for the first time. So the data in this table are actually the only ones we have so far for those schemes. The 4 important schemes below the line are all ones that have been running for many, many years and have been, so there are a lot of data available on our website if you want to look back over the history of how they've been funded. So if we look at those top 4, I think the really striking awful thing is the second column from the right, the funded rate, which shows how low the success rates are at the moment in those 4 schemes. And so in investigator grants, in its first 2 years, we've had 13.2% and a 13.3% success rate. So these are really important pieces of information about just how competitive these schemes are. Synergy grants were a little bit better at 15.6%. Ideas grants 11.1%, again disturbingly low, and a very low success rate for clinical trials and cohort study scheme. And so I've already pointed out that we had roughly $7.8 billion requests for $850 million budget in 2019, and this really is just an indicator of the size of our research sector, the dynamism of it, the tremendous amount of demand there is for research funding across Australia, and at least just looking at the NHMRC budget, of course, not nearly enough money to fund it to the level that we'd like to. But I think it is important to realise that some of those other schemes offer really valuable opportunities, and up till now their success rates have been a good deal higher than in these 4 new schemes that are above that line halfway down the slide. And so it is worth looking at other schemes and thinking about how they might suit your research and whether there are opportunities for you there. So then one of the issues that we pay a great deal of attention to, and I know the broader sector does as well, is how funding is awarded across the 4 broad research areas. And if you've already applied for grants, you'll know that these areas that you choose yourself. So you tick a box that indicates whether your research is basic science, clinical, health services, or public health. So we don't look at whether that's an accurate description or not, and we're simply reporting here the data as based on your selection of the type of research that you do. And if we look across the total commitments of money in the 2019 round, you'll see that we have the largest amount going to basic science at around 42.4% for all schemes, and the next biggest is 35.4%. So those numbers have stayed roughly the same over the long term. Clinical has grown a little bit, basic has gone down a bit, public health has grown probably more than some of the others, and health services research is growing a little bit with some extra support through our structural priority funding. But really, basic science and clinical medicine and science capture the great majority of the research that NHMRC is funding. And it also pretty much reflects the distribution of applications we receive. So most of the applications we receive fall into those 2 broad research areas. I think what's interesting is when you look on the right-hand side of this slide, you'll see that there's quite a bit of difference between the schemes in the areas of research that are being funded. And I know this is getting a lot of attention, but broadly this up to a point, it reflects the distribution of applications we receive. And that's particularly true for ideas grants, where really the great majority of ideas grants given in the first round were basic science, but actually the great majority of applications we received were also in basic science. In investigator grants, it's a great deal more mixed, and of course in the clinical trials and cohort studies grants, they're mostly clinical, as you'd expect. Now, I'm going to show some data which aren't up on the web. They're not in the fact sheets that we've posted on the web on investigator grants and ideas grants, but I think they're really interesting and probably particularly useful for you to get an insight into the distribution of career stages of applicants to our schemes. So this shows for the 2019 rounds, investigator grants on the left and ideas grants on the right. In the higher bars, somebody's probably needs to mute there. In the higher bars, you can see the distribution of applications. And here, I think it's quite interesting to see that for investigator grants, there's a very big peak of applications at the 5 to 10 year post-PhD stage. And so we're getting a lot of applications from early to mid-career researchers. Ideas grants, the distribution of stage post-PhD is rather broader and somewhat older if you were to look at the mean or the median. But the investigator grants, it's highly, highly competitive at that early to mid-career stage. Of course, the smaller bars show you the grants that were awarded, and they don't peak to the same extent as the applications. This partly reflects the way the budget is currently deliberately distributed across the EL1, EL2 and leadership L levels of investigator grants. And so that distribution of funding is one of the very important issues that we're seeking advice from our research committee this year, because I think we have some very difficult issues to face about what will be an appropriate distribution of grants across career stages, given the distribution of applications, but also the importance of providing funding across all career stages. So these issues are not as simple as they immediately look, and it's a very important discussion that we're having with research committee about that. So we might see changes in this distribution over time, and I hope that we find a good way to do that. The peak of awards of ideas grants follows more closely the peak of applications, and of course that partly reflects the fact that there's no deliberate distribution of funding across age groups in ideas grants. It's just an open competition regardless of career stage. Now I wanted to show you the investigator grants 2020 data, and so that's on the next slide, and what I've done is just put it on the right hand side of the slide so you can compare it with the 2019 data. And really they're incredibly similar. So in 2020 we also had a peak of applications from people at 5 to 10 years post-PhD. I should just point out in passing that these years post-PhD have not been adjusted for career disruption. They're just the raw numbers as calculated from a date of award of PhD as provided to us in RGMS or SAPPHIRE. So the distribution has been very similar in both years. Just in 2020, I'd say perhaps maybe the biggest difference I notice is a somewhat smaller number of applications from people at 0 to 2 years post-PhD. Now, to look at the investigator grant outcomes by career stage in 2020 in a slightly different way, now showing the stages along the bottom, emerging leadership levels 1 and 2, leaderships levels 1, 2 and 3, and then all of them together on the right. You can see, not surprisingly, at L3, just about everybody is more than 10 years post-PhD. There's a very small number of people who don't have PhDs and have other degrees that are equivalent. All of the L2s, I think, were more than 10 years post-PhD. There were some L1s who were under 10 years post-PhD. And then, of course, in the emerging leadership levels, you see a much more mixed career stage. And we're just really pleased to see that both in 2019 and 2020, there were a significant number of EL1 awards that went to people who were within 2 years of receiving their PhD or had not yet received their PhD. So that's as it should be. And of course, there are also quite a few people who are somewhat more senior than that. Again, these years post-PhD haven't been adjusted for career disruption. So quite a number of people in these emerging leadership levels will in fact have the equivalent of fewer years post-PhD because they've had time out, particularly for family responsibilities. Now, I want to say a little bit about gender, some of these data are already online, but the 2020 data haven't been displayed this way on our website up to this point. Now, this tells us something very important about the health and medical research sector. It shows application numbers with seniority and shows that we have more women than men applying at EL1 and EL2 in both years of the scheme. But after that, we see a rapidly declining proportion of applicants who are female at those leadership levels. This truly reflects our academic structure through the universities and institutes, but it's one of the issues that really disturbs us, and we know that the reasons that women tend to disappear at more senior levels are very, very complex, and we can write a long list of them. But it's a fundamental problem in our sector, and we would like to see that change. And in our the extent to which we can affect this at NHMRC, we would like to do that. Now, on the right is the funded rates, and the 2019 data caused a little bit of consternation because of the big difference in success rate for men and women at the upper level at L3, very similar success rates across the rest of the levels. Now, it's a little bit different for 2020, and it just shows that one can't draw too many conclusions from a single year of funding. In fact, we had better success rates for women than for men at L1 and L2 in 2020, and a smaller gap at the L3 level, which was good to see. But it is important to remember that these funded rates are affected by our structural priority funding. And so some of the women who received funding through this scheme in both 2019 and 2020 received it through structural funding, and that was spread across all levels. But we need to look at multiple years, of course, to see whether there are really patterns of where men are more likely to be successful than women. And last year's result, fortunately, wasn't as seen to such an extreme degree this year. Now, this has got a bit of data on it, but again, it's outcomes of schemes by gender. And I'll look at the left-hand side first, which is grants awarded. And I put an asterisk on the bars where there was some additional funding for women delivered through the structural priority budget, which I've already explained. And you can see we did that for investigator grants, ideas grants, and the clinical trials and cohort studies grants in 2019. We didn't do it for synergy grants, and in fact, we didn't need to do it for synergy grants because we had such good diversity amongst applications and awards through the synergy grant scheme. And as it turned out, there were somewhat more grants led by female CIAs than male CIAs in the first round of synergy grants. But you can see that we're seeing smaller numbers of grants, just as we've seen smaller numbers of applications for women than men in investigator ideas and CTCS. And so we have intervened to fund additional women below the line, as I've described. Now, what that resulted in was, in ideas grants, in fact, we had an identical success rate for men and women at 11.1%. We had a better success rate for women than men in synergy grants without any intervention, and we somewhat bridged the gap for investigator grants. So to move on, I won't go through this list in detail. Most of this information is on our web page, and the page on women in health science on our website has recently been updated and has a table that's very like the one that's shown here. But it lists quite a number of activities and initiatives that we've introduced to address the gender disparities that are so apparent in the previous slides. And I'd be very happy to talk about more of that if you want to in the discussion. Now, I just want to say a few things of general advice, and perhaps this is redundant because Elizabeth has already made some extremely important points, and I know the rest of your workshop is going to be focused on a great deal of detail here that and from fantastic people who will be able to give you insights that I would not be able to. But I did want to say a few things, and I hope they're useful as a starting point for your future discussions throughout this workshop. The first is, as I've emphasised already, to remember the purpose of NHMRC funding and to think about applications to NHMRC as being related to how we will improve the health of the Australian population through research, whether we take a long-term or a short-term view to when that impact will be achieved. It's really important early on when you're thinking about writing grants to open user accounts with Grant Connect and Sapphire. Neither of these are things that should be left to the last minute. Grant Connect has a lot of guidelines and information in it that you won't have access to otherwise. And it's very, very important to read all of the guidelines for applications to the schemes you're interested in, and also for peer review of the schemes you're interested in, because these are the documents that will give you insight into what NHMRC is looking for and what peer reviewers will be looking for. It's just critical to know what those things are before you start writing your grant and preparing, designing your project, and not wait until you're just polishing it to submit. I'd encourage you to learn about and think about research quality and integrity. Ultimately, the productivity of your research will depend on both of these, as will your reputation as a researcher. NHMRC is very interested in promoting research quality, and we have a critical role in promoting research integrity. And I encourage you early on in your career and repeatedly to read the Australian Code for the Responsible Conduct of Research and the guidelines that are attached to it. These are really important issues about how we make sure that the research that we do is good, high quality research. We may not always get the interpretation right, but the data must be sound, and we must present it accurately and honestly if we're to make a useful contribution and for to be believed by our colleagues. There's an element of research integrity which is also about how we interact with our colleagues and treat everybody we work with, whether they're collaborators, patients, or any groups that we collaborate with through our research, that we do that with integrity and honesty. It's critical to the quality of what we will produce and our reputations as researchers. Participate in peer review. It's the best way to learn about what peer review really means, and you'll get a very different perspective in thinking about your applications once you know what it's like to be on the other side of the virtual table. And seek advice from mentors, colleagues, and your research admin office. And obviously, by joining this workshop, you're doing exactly that, but it's an ongoing process, and there are a lot of people who can help you. So it's important to understand the purpose of each scheme and the assessment criteria, understand the eligibility criteria and the capping rules that we have between different schemes, understand the intensity of the competition and the nature of the competition, and put yourself in the place of the reviewer. Think like a reviewer, and that's why reading the peer review guidelines is very important as well. Understanding the competition isn't designed to make you despair about your chance of getting a grant. It's really all about giving yourself the best chance of getting a grant by understanding exactly what the competition is that you're entering into and what the rules are by which it's administered. Now, we've got some information in Grant Connect with the past investigator grants documents on the feedback we received from assessors about what made a high scoring grant or a low scoring grant in the 2019 round, and that'll be updated for the next round with information and feedback from peer reviewers of the 2020 round, but they're very similar. So just very briefly, and there's more detail in the document that's in Grant Connect, the assessors told us that what they were impressed by was people who followed the applicant guidance correctly, and it's amazing that apparently many people don't. They're looking in investigator grants for clear evidence of an upward career trajectory. They want to see tangible examples to illustrate the impact of past research. And I know you'll talk about that some more. They want to see strong, clear statements on the top 5 publications. They want to see a proposed program of research, not disparate projects. And of course, the more senior you are, the more important it is to be able to present your research in a programmatic way. But it is a 5-year grant looking for a program of research. Clear statements on how the proposed research is a progression from current activities, and limited use of jargon and discipline-specific terminology. Now, conversely, the low-scoring applications were characterised by being poorly constructed or poorly written, not following the guidance to applicants, not following the instructions, fewer publications than expected relative to opportunity and career disruptions, not effectively conveying significance and impact of the top 5 publications. Obviously, this is complementary to the previous slide. Not correctly addressing the impact criteria, no cohesive outline of 5-year research program, and research outcomes poorly defined. Now, these are, I think, they're kind of obvious things, but they're just, it's incredibly useful to get these overarching responses, I think, from peer reviewers who have looked at many of these applications and have a good sense of what is exciting and impressive for them versus those which are disappointing and less likely to rank well. Now, there are some comments here on ideas grants for 2019 as well, and they're rather similar to the extent that they're also focusing on applicants addressing the criteria clearly, being well-written applications, easy to read, not full of errors, clear and concise, and as Elizabeth has already said, written for a general audience, avoiding jargon, easy to follow for non-experts, because you won't necessarily be talking to the person who's deeply expert in your very precise field of research. And I know, as an immunologist, having reviewed many immunology grants over the years in my previous life, even as an immunologist, you could find the jargon and the shorthand being just incredibly difficult to get through if they weren't the particular set of acronyms and tyrosine kinases and receptors, for example, that you were using yourself. And conversely, for low-scoring applications, not following the applicant guidance, being poorly constructed, poorly prepared, too technical or dense, or assuming knowledge, or on the other hand, not providing enough detail to be understood. These, I think, useful little pieces of feedback that are just overarching, sensible comments that are useful to keep in mind as you prepare your applications. Now, we're living in an extraordinary time, and this slide is here just to remind us that everything that I've just said somehow belongs to, it's still the real world, but our real world today is very greatly affected by what's happening around us with COVID-19, acutely arising again in Victoria now, but a concern for all of us wherever we are in the country. Now, that's, of course, been a huge change for everybody working this year, and of course for NHMRC as well. I'll say a little bit on the next slide about the grant program and the impact of COVID-19 on that, but I just thought I'd take this opportunity to say a few words about what we've done otherwise than in modifying the grant program. Now, NHMRC in the past, when there have been infectious disease emergencies, has rolled out urgent research calls to provide some extra funding for people to work on the outbreak as it arose. And so we did that, for example, in 2009 with the flu pandemic. But we had the experience then, as we had in previous outbreaks, that it's very, very difficult to do that at very short notice when you're in the middle of an outbreak. And so the decision was taken a few years ago that NHMRC should be investing in preparedness for pandemic research. And as it turned out, that was a very timely strategic decision. So back in 2014-15, NHMRC called for applications for a special centre of research excellence with double the usual budget, $5 million over 5 years, to build up capacity to respond rapidly to do the research that you need during an emergency in infectious diseases. The successful application for that grant was the CRE, which is now called a PRIZE, Australian Partnership for Preparedness Research on Infectious Disease Emergencies, which is a national network led out of the Doherty Institute in Melbourne, but far greater than the Doherty because it draws in many of the relevant infectious disease and related researchers around the country. And it's turned out to be a very effective network during this COVID-19 pandemic. So they received $5 million in the first instance, and the original grant guidelines allowed for the opportunity for NHMRC to ask the successful centre to do additional research if required during an emergency. Excuse me. And so using that clause, we called on a prize to submit a further proposal. We took that through a panel peer review and awarded an additional $2 million of emergency funding to be spent, particularly this year and the first half of next year. So that's been, sorry, NHMRC's specific targeted investment in COVID-19 research, but we're also delivering the MRFF urgent research calls that have been rolled out rapidly and effectively over these first few months of the pandemic. Excuse me. We're also providing a secretariat for a new national committee, the National COVID-19 Health and Research Advisory Committee, which is advising the CMO. And that's been going since April, and a very, very active committee. And then we also, in April, published guidance on our website on clinical trials and animal research in the context of COVID-19. And the clinical trials work was done with jurisdictions and is being widely promulgated. So those are the broad things that NHMRC has done in response to COVID-19. I think of more interest today is to talk about the changes that we needed to make to the 2020 grant program in recognition of the very dramatic impact of the pandemic and the lockdown on researchers around the country and on clinicians who are then again now, of course, particularly in Victoria and New South Wales, at the front line again. So we needed to make these decisions back in March when I'm afraid we were still on a rising curve of notifications of COVID-19 cases. And so we had no idea how this was going to play out. But I think even in retrospect, when we look back and we see how effectively the pandemic was controlled in the first instance, these were appropriate decisions to make. And with the resurgence that we are now seeing, I think we're hoping that they will stand up through whatever is coming next. We took the decision to cancel the 2020 Synergy Grants round, which was a really tough decision to take because we knew there were many applications in preparation, and we knew that this was an upsetting decision to make for the sector. But the peer review load for this relatively small scheme is very, very intense, and we were very concerned about the ability of the sector to deliver that peer review under the circumstances that we appeared to be facing. But we wanted to focus on keeping the other schemes going, and particularly ideas grants, because investigator grants was already basically finished, but ideas grants, we knew as our second biggest scheme, our attention should be on being able to deliver that and to conduct peer review for that scheme. So we delayed the deadline, first of all, by 5 weeks, ultimately by 6 weeks for that scheme. And as you know, we have received just under 3,000 applications, so people were able to write their grants clearly. We delayed the deadline for the clinical trials and cohort studies grants by 7 months because of the impact of the pandemic on clinicians and public health researchers. We've streamlined peer review for 2020 ideas grants, again, to reduce the peer review load. We've done this by removing the GRP stage of review and relying on independent assessments. If we hadn't done that, we would need to run GRPs over the holiday period around Christmas, New Year, or have a very, very delayed process, and we would certainly not be able to have outcomes by the end of the year if we were to run GRPs this year. So those decisions have been taken, and I think they will play out well as the year goes on. At least we certainly hope they do. We've published on our website in FAQs advice on the flexibility that's being provided for variations to research direction. So if people are pivoting their research to COVID-19 research, we want to encourage that if it's appropriate for their skills and the sort of research that they do. We've providing flexibility on grant extensions and reporting. And we'd also point out that the impacts of COVID-19 on people's research careers as a result of the lockdown are absolutely issues that fall under the career disruption and relative to opportunity policy framework Short disruptions will of course fit more with relative to opportunity, but if because of illness or other significant effects which fit under the career disruption policy, they fall there, then that will certainly apply and of course be taken into account. Now, just to highlight a few things that we're working on and thinking about and that you'll hear more about from us in the future, either very soon or over the coming 6 to 12 months. I've got a few things listed here. Now, for all schemes, we're looking at the timing of the grant schemes for next year. And these, of course, are affected by the fact that we've got delays this year. The delay to ideas grants, but particularly the delay to the clinical trials and cohort studies scheme affects the timing of schemes next year. And so we've been working hard on trying to design a schedule that would work as best we can next year to get a bit closer to normality again. And we'll be announcing that soon. We're just consulting with Research Committee on it at the moment. But it's particularly important to let you know soon about those opening and close dates for the major schemes that you'll be interested in. Sapphire is now being used for all grant applications, but peer review and the subsequent stages are partly Sapphire, partly the old RGMS. And so that development of those other modules of Sapphire continues in the background and will be continuing very intensely over the next 6 to 12 months as we try to complete that very large and complex project. So we know there are still bits that are a little bit rough around the edges with Sapphire that people experienced in submitting their ideas grant applications, and those will all be gradually ironed out over time as we roll out this new program. We'll shortly be introducing advice on the use of gender-neutral language as one of our initiatives to foster a reduction in the disparities between men and women in success rates in our schemes. And so you'll hear more about that from us before too long. We've been working hard on our career disruption and relative to opportunity policy and want to make changes there. We're consulting on that at the moment, and you'll hear more about that from us in the future. And we want to put a big focus on peer review training because this is something that we haven't been able to concentrate on over the last 2 or 3 years as we've introduced the new grant program and now, of course, faced the pandemic. But it is a very important focus for the short term. I've mentioned already that we're very concerned about the funding distribution across the investigator grant levels, and we're working hard and will do so over the coming months with Research Committee on exactly this issue. And then for both synergy grants and ideas grants, we are looking at how to simplify peer review while retaining appropriately rigorous processes. And so over time, you'll hear more from us about that as well. I want to just finish up by saying again that our main role is to support high quality research that will improve human health, and that's the lens through which we look at everything. That our grant program aims to support every sort of health and medical research, but in different ways through different schemes. So you need to choose schemes that are appropriate for the type of work you do and the way you work to achieve your goals. Of course, NHMRC schemes are highly competitive. We can't hide from that fact. And so it's really important for people to understand the schemes, read the guidelines, think about it from the peer reviewer's point of view and remember what they're looking for, and plan ahead and get advice. And I strongly support Elizabeth's comment about starting to prepare applications a very long time in advance so that you can think about them, talk about them, get the advice you need and build up collaborations. There's another element of that we've been reminded of this year, and that is how when something like the pandemic comes along, suddenly all your plans and all our plans are thrown into disarray. We never know when these things are going to happen. And so for people who were well ahead in developing their grant applications, but then found themselves at home and looking after homeschooling and all the other sorts of issues that people have needed to deal with during the lockdown, those people will have been in a much better situation than the people who'd left it to the last minute to start preparing their applications. And so I think we've had just an acute reminder this year of the value of planning ahead and getting started early. Watch out for announcements from us in Tracker and in Grant Connect, because changes in policy will always be announced there. And finally, focus on what really matters. Research quality, research integrity, and the ultimate impact of what you're trying to achieve. And I think if those issues are your main focus as you develop your career, then your career will be the most productive that it can be. I think it's easy to be distracted by thinking about how many committees I should be on or how many boxes I can tick. What really matters is your research contribution, and I hope we can support you to achieve that. So thank you very much, and good luck.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Anne. That was really an excellent overview, and we really appreciate your time in giving us an update on NHMRC, particularly in these movable times. We've got a few questions on the chat, and if anybody has a specific question and they'd like to show their video and or put a message on the chat, we'll take some questions now for about 20-25 minutes with Anne. There was a brief question from one on the chat about nominating on the new Sapphire system as a reviewer, and so probably one of our team could help with that, but there is an area to nominate as a reviewer. Is that correct, Anne? Well,
I actually don't know. I don't know whether somebody from my team, Julie Glover, or another member of her team joined us today, because there'll be technical, yes, Julie's there, she may be able to answer the question, right? Because there'll be technical things like this that I'm afraid I don't know the details of.
Okay, we can hold that one over.
Julie's right there if she's able
Julie,
to.
do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, so we've already gone out for our nominations for peer reviewers this year for most of the schemes, although obviously for the MRFF schemes, there's new schemes coming on board. So we're always happy to have nominations for peer reviewers. So usually the last process was through RGMS, and we're working through to build that in the new system as well. But watch Tracker later this year, and we'll put out a notice as well then about how to nominate. I'm always happy to get nominations, so you can email me directly.
Thanks, Julie. Great. Peter's got his hand up. Peter Sly, thank you. Peter, you've got a question?
And thanks for the presentation, the information, Anne. One of the things we saw between the first two rounds of the investigator grants was a really big change in the emphasis on the impact statement, and the fact that people who had done their work beforehand had to turn around and redo it. Are there any planned changes to the guidelines for this next round? Are they the ones that these guys here are working on?
No, I'm not. We haven't talked about making changes to the guidance there. Again, Julie might have insight into whether there's been any feedback from assessors from the investigator grant round that would suggest there needs to be further clarification, because what we are trying to do with changes over time is to clarify areas where there's been confusion or where it's turned out that we haven't been explicit enough. And so it's those sorts of, it's really an evolution in response to feedback over time. And I haven't heard that there's a need for us to have further clarification of the impact part of the track record. No, and Julie's shaking her head, so no changes planned at this stage.
Thanks, Anne.
A good question from one of our ECRs. Will Sapphire be able to accommodate consumers as investigators? At the moment, it isn't really set up to support this.
Yeah, it's a really important point that was brought to our attention not so long ago. And we have to find a way to do this because clearly, well, we need to be able to have diverse teams. We know that for some sorts of grants, it's particularly important to have consumers, but it's the question then in the first instance of whether they should be AIs or CIs. But we do need to be able to accommodate a diversity of people, including those who aren't classic academics, through Sapphire. So I haven't heard what work is being done specifically on that, but we are aware of the problem.
I think it's essential in some things, particularly the CREs.
Yeah.
Another question, will there be any likelihood of a delay in the investigator grant due date this year?
Yes.
So that it won't be delayed, or it could be?
It's very likely it's not going to be the same timing as the first two rounds. And so that's the piece of information that as soon as it's set, is the most urgent to get out to applicants. And it's is all related to the flow-on effects of the impact this year. So we're just consulting with Research Committee on the whole schedule, which is the schedule for all schemes, but particularly for the 4 new grant program schemes, which interact in various ways because of capping. Well, 3 of them interact because of capping rules. And so I won't second guess it now. I won't say when we think the timing will be right now, but I hope we'll be able to announce very, very shortly exactly what that timing is so that people can prepare for it. But it will be later, not earlier than in previous rounds for investigator grants.
Okay. There's a quick question about previously you could exclude nominated reviewers in assessing your application due to potential conflicts of interest. This is no longer an option in new grant submissions. Is that correct?
Yes, and I think I don't know all of the history of this, but I think it was removed some time ago. And my understanding of at least one of the factors there is that it's turns out quite often to be the case that people are excluded inappropriately because it turns out that they are actually, they may be supportive reviewers. Sometimes people don't know who their supportive and unsupportive reviewers are. It's very important that if there's an actual conflict of interest that we detect that through the normal conflict of interest process where people identify their conflicts. And then, of course, if we're aware of conflicts, then we can follow up anything as well. But Julie might like to add to that if there's anything further to say. She'll be closer to the policy than I am.
Yeah, so I think it was taken out of the policies quite early in my time at NHMRC, and we did a lot of consultation, I think, with Research Committee and discussion. And some of the issues were that people were nominating quite a few people who were in their field. And when we actually, or it sort of turned out that that they weren't really conflicts of interest per se. It was more that people thought they wouldn't give a favourable review, not necessarily that they wouldn't give a fair review. And as Anne has mentioned, our actual experience of those, you know, often when people they say, I think that this peer reviewer is such and such and they've reviewed my application unfairly, they are like 99.9% wrong when they say that. They have those concerns. So we certainly looked at it very closely when we took it out, and we thought that the integrity of the system relies on those self-declarations, and that's what we absolutely rely on.
Thank you. One's from a very early career researcher who's less than 1 year post-PhD. This is a question I think we often get. What is your advice about when to apply for the EL1? At what point are we likely to be competitive, trying to weigh up spending time focused on outputs versus grant writing? So noticing that you didn't fund many in the first 2 years post-PhD.
Yeah, and I think that this is something that's a really important issue to discuss with supervisors and mentors, because it's very hard to give blanket advice. I mean, we're aware of people who have quite a lot of research experience even before they start their PhDs and are already quite mature researchers and have well-developed track records and well on their way. And so the years post-PhD is a pretty crude indicator of people's readiness. But at the same time, it's really important that the investigator grant scheme does support people who are very early in their careers and are the traditional person who's gone straight into a PhD and then straight into a postdoc and may not have had other research experience. So that's why I emphasised how pleased we were that despite this being a new scheme with some pretty rigorous track record requirements, that we have quite a number of EL1s who are in their first 2 years or post PhD or haven't even finished their PhDs yet. We want people to apply at that level. We want people to get grants at that level. And then for the individual, I think it's best to get advice from supervisors and mentors.
I guess related to that is obviously there's a bit of a bottleneck at EL2 and L1, and possibly in changing the structure of the scheme, there's less opportunities there, you know, with where there was the CDF and there was the early career research, the early career researchers and the CDFs, and there was 4 categories sort of at that younger sort of level, and then the higher levels. I just wonder, are you thinking maybe because it's a sort of 2 to 7 year group that are potentially in the middle there, and you've got some people coming down to L1 who are over 10 years, and, you know, should they be at L1? And I know this is a sort of a debate around the universities as to what advice people put their level at. Does NHMRC have any kind of thoughts on this, and whether they will try and increase the sort of structure?
Well, I'm really worried about how we do this in a rational, principle-based way, and so that's why it's a very intense discussion to be had with Research Committee, and we're just sort of preparing for that discussion to start in full now. But we're all worried about it, in fact, this squeeze in the middle, what we're calling the squeeze in the middle or the pinch point, which is at EL2 and L1, is exactly where it was in the old fellowship schemes as well. CDF and SRFA. So it was just a little bit less obvious because it wasn't all there in a single scheme, and people may not have been quite as aware. It's very similar in that way. And so, I mean, we'd like to fund more of everybody. That's the first thing to say. We definitely want to be funding people to come into the system. We don't want to have this huge bottleneck at the middle, but that's also where we get the most applications. And so if you said, okay, let's stop funding at the upper end of the scale, well, then you cut out some of our most experienced researchers around the country who themselves are mentoring the next generation. And the people who are surviving through NHMRC to be emerging as L3 investigator grant holders are highly selected, very, very successful people. And so the easy way would be to say, stop funding the L3s and put that money into the EL2s and the L1s. And then you'd be doing a different type of damage to the system as a whole. So I find these issues quite vexed. I don't think it's a simple issue at all. And it's one that's really a whole of sector problem that we will influence to a little degree by the way we fund investigator grants, but it's an issue across the whole sector of how we provide ongoing research careers for a large and very excellent group of early and mid-career researchers that we have in this country.
Yes, I always think it's the engine room that you've got to grow up to sort of replace yourself with. But yeah, one of the people points out that it's possibly the advice being given by universities to sort of go at a lower level to have more chance of success, which is sort of partly creating the bottleneck. Yeah. Now, Paul Colditz, I think you had a particular question that you wanted to ask. Paul, did you want to come on? Yeah.
Yes. Thanks, Ros, and thanks, Anne, very much for your presentation. I guess why am I feeling despondent in my question? I'm following later today to provide some advice on how to follow your advice to write well-written and easy-to-read grant applications. Now, that implies that there's a learning process, that my presentation will somehow increase capacity. But it's very interesting that the data I refer to there across the investigator seniority levels, there's not actually an increase in the success rate. So it either means that that we're not learning, we're not getting better, that we're not capable of learning how to write better written and easy to read grants, or there's another explanation. And I think I know the answer, but it would probably be very reassuring to some of the early career people online to hear it from you. What is the explanation relative to the fact that it's apparent that maybe we can't learn to write better grant applications because the success rate doesn't go up across investigator levels?
You probably want to know more about the people behind the numbers. When you go to, if you look at the data from the point of view of level applied for rather than number of years post-PhD, because it's a different answer. It's the number of years post-PhD which is giving you the data that you're just saying that you haven't got a very high success rate, even if somebody's more than 40 years post-PhD. If you look at the L3s, the success rate is very high. So you've got what you do, if you're brave enough to apply at L3, you're a highly selected person who has clearly won a lot of NHMRC or other forms of funding in the past, and you know how to write a good grant, as presumably you also know how to do good research, and you know, want to not lose sight of the fact that this is about doing and supporting good research, not just writing a good grant. I didn't show the data in my talk today, but they are available in the fact sheets online. But the success rate at L3 is very, very high compared with other levels. And so the people who know that they must apply at L3 because they are so senior and nobody would dream of thinking they should apply at L1 or L2, and are also the people who've been highly selected by the system can write a good grant. But I think we have to worry that people aren't not paying enough attention to the need to write a really clear and understandable grant, and maybe that's one of the issues, Paul, that you want to talk about.
Good. So I think Peter's got a follow-up question on this, because he tells me he could still be funded till the age of 90 with 3 more L3s. So Peter, what did you have to say?
4 more L3s. There is a slight anomaly in the scheme, Anne, that comes in because it's a new scheme, and any individual's eligible for 5 successful applications. You know, and my next year will be my first L3, which means I can have 4 more and takes me up to the age of 90, which I don't think is a good idea for anybody, including me. Can you think a little bit, or can you expand on the thinking of the limit and the number of fellowship applications that investigator grants that a person can have? Because if someone starts off at L1, they've only got 5, and you know, that some of us have been, as you know, been around the scheme a lot longer than that. So what's the thinking, and what is the top end solution?
Yeah, so I think this is a really interesting question, and it was a big step, I think, that NHMRC took in putting any limits at all. Under the old fellowship schemes, there were no limits, and people could be SPRF until they were 120 if they lived that long. And so it was exactly the same situation, only completely uncapped. And we thought when we introduced this integrated investigator grant scheme, it was very important to start putting some kind of constraints on that. So we saw 2 problems in fellowships. We saw that people could stay in the system forever and ever and ever as long as they were competitive, and you could argue that that's fair. But we also saw a lot of people who would get about halfway up the scheme and then stay there and would have their entire career at SRFB or something like that, the old equivalent of something between L1 and L2. And we thought it's not the intention of NHMRC to provide an entire career. It's to provide funding for the best people who are applying to do high quality research, and to remember that there are other parts of the system that we might hope will support people for the longer term as well. So we introduced those caps as a step to really put into practice something that NHMRC had said for decades, and that is that we're not there to provide a career. It's true. I mean, it's great to hear, Peter, that at 90 you're still going to be going so well, and it could be argued that if you're as effective and as productive when you're 90 as you are now when you are presumably only about 50, although I know actually because we're contemporaries.
No, if you do the maths, I'm 65.
Yes, yeah, I was just saying we are contemporaries, so I know how old you are, and now you know roughly how old I am, except I'm a little bit older. So it'll be fantastic if you can still have L3 at 90, but probably most people will have retired by then. And I guess on the whole, we hope that they will have.
And we've got a good question here from Amy. Do you think it's the duty of the NHMRC or the universities to reconcile promotion levels for investigation grants? I'm asking this knowing that there are several EL2 awardees that are professors.
We've spent a lot of time over the years talking about titles and this issue, questions of academic level and titles and whether they should be considerations in eligibility. And we ran into trouble with this back in earlier times with the CDF scheme when a decision was made. I can't remember the details of it now, haven't thought about it for quite a while, but it was effectively excluding people who'd reached associate professor, I think, or it might have been professor from CDFs. And it very quickly became apparent that that was an inappropriate way to exclude some people. There were people who'd been promoted to those levels for reasons other than their research careers. And we know in universities, you know, you've got broadly three components which contribute to people's academic progression: research, administration, and teaching. And the balance between those can differ enormously from one person to the next. So to say that somebody who's relatively early in their research career should be excluded because they've got to a high academic level because of their strength in other areas wouldn't be appropriate, would be unfair. So, and similarly, academic levels, whether you talk about A, B, C, D, E, also are not terribly useful in assessing somebody's research maturity, if you like. So for that reason, we've chosen not to use titles or levels as criteria and simply to focus on years post-PhD for that threshold for EL1 to EL1, EL2 to L.
Good. And I had a question. You used to have your very helpful TRIP fellowships, and which I think was a very important area for, you know, combined clinical and research track record for people to talk about knowledge translation and implementation science. I think it's a shame that you've discontinued that scheme, and I know I've had several TRIP fellows who really gained a lot from that whole training process. I wondered, do you think that's now covered by your increased capacity looking for health services research? Is that where you see that kind of in maybe people should be flagging their work more as health services research when they're looking at implementation science?
It's a great question, Ros, because I agree it was a niche scheme, but an important and useful one, and we hoped that the investigator grant scheme would accommodate at least some of those people as well, because it allows for part-time. It strongly focuses on impact, and that's highly relevant. And for people, at least if they've already done research, then they've got a lot of potential to demonstrate impact very clearly through the type of research that tended to be supported through TRIP fellowships. And of course, it really extends that type of idea across all career levels, not just the early career level that the TRIPs were. So we hoped that the design of the investigator grant scheme would pick up everything that was covered by all of the different types of fellowships we had before. And apart from TRIPs, the other special one was practitioner fellowships, 50% clinical fellowships. And again, we hope that the design of the investigator grant scheme picks up those sorts of people.
Good. Final question. your clinical trials scheme and cohort studies obviously has a very tough success rate, and you're obviously getting a lot of submissions. You know, I know because in my area in clinical trials, you know, they're very expensive to conduct, and obviously interventions is an important priority. And I think there's a lot of people who have shifted from project grants to that scheme. Is there any thought that you might increase the sort of budget for allocation, or you're not sure about that?
We'd love to increase the budget. We'd have to take it from somewhere.
Yeah.
And, you know, any advice about where we should take it from would be gratefully received, because
Yeah.
it's, I mean, it's a $70 million budget at the moment. It was actually 74 or 5 million in the end, in the last round. So you could take that money out of investigator grants, and nobody wants to do that. You could take it out of ideas grants, and nobody wants to do that. If you look at the other schemes that you have to choose from, they're all smaller than 70 million. So you'd have to, I mean, CREs is only 35 million a year. So you could bring the success rate of the 2019 CTCS round up to 7.5 or 8% by completely eliminating CREs. So unfortunately, these are the really impossible choices.
Yeah, no, I don't think I'd encourage that, because I can see the CREs are extremely competitive. I guess the suggestion comes from Peter that maybe thinking about the MRFF, and obviously they've replaced a lot of their sort of, but they're very short focus, short time frame when you're applying for MRFF, but a lot of them are clinical trials. And so with that, I mean, how does that sort of fit with some of the MRFF budget coming back to the clinical trials cohort study scheme?
Yes, well, we've had a lot of people say that NHMRC should stop funding clinical trials because the MRFF does, and it's
no way.
all the MRFF. But we think it's very important, and particularly the way the MRFF is working at the moment, we think it's important that we go on funding. But it's certainly true that the MRFF is putting a significant amount of money into clinical trials, but they will always be around some priority area. And so I think the important thing about our scheme is that it's like all of our schemes, almost all of our schemes, it's not topic specific. And so any kind of clinical trial or cohort study can come to our scheme, and people don't necessarily have that opportunity with MRFF. But hopefully together, those two sources of funding will keep a very vibrant clinical trials sector going. But it is one of our dilemmas of that very low success rate.
Well, thank you very much, Anne, for the wonderful overview and update. We really appreciate your coming on personally to give us that. Elizabeth, I think, has a final question or comment, and we really appreciate your advice. And it's, yeah, Elizabeth, you had something else, yeah?
Oh, sorry, it was just a clap to say thank you to Anne. It's really wonderful to have your time with us today.
So thank you very much, Anne. We're going to go to a break now, and if we've got any other questions that come, we'll pop them through to you on email. But we really appreciate you coming and giving everybody, particularly the ECRs, a direct update from you at NHMRC. So thank you very much.